So let's make a start on this talk. So I'm going to start with a quote which arrived in my inbox yesterday by coincidence. So I have to go with that. All serious thoughts begin in a moment of unsettling or delighted surprise. Not that is a simple twinge of curiosity or bafflement regarding some fact out there, not yet in one's possession. It's the sudden awareness that no mere fact can possibly be an adequate explanation of the mystery in which one finds oneself immersed in every moment. It's the astonishing recollection of something one has forgotten only because it's always present. So today we're celebrating the Buddha's enlightenment. We are remembering, recollecting the stories that evoke the life of this extraordinary being. And we are recollecting as a means to honor the Buddha. And in doing this, we're not only honoring the Buddha, but we're also celebrating and honoring the true potential of our own precious lives that he's pointing towards. So perhaps today this celebration seems even much more poignant, as we might be recognizing in our own lives with greater clarity the value of each and every human life, including our own, and see possibly even more vividly how easily it is to lose this precious life. We also might be recognizing how easy it is for the Dharma, the path to liberation that the Buddha has discovered, can become lost or obscured amongst the pressing concerns and anxieties that we find ourselves in the midst of this pandemic. So the reason we are recollecting the Buddha, honoring the Buddha today, is to protect a connecting thread that leads us towards an open field. We often talk about the gap, and it's the gap into which we can still step that was established, created by the Buddha. So we recollect the Buddha to ensure that the path to the unbound, the unfabricated, the deathless, this open dimension of being remains open in our own life, open for the life of the Sangha, for the benefit of all. So I'm going to be evoking the Buddha by telling the story of a series of tests through which full enlightenment was realized. I'm taking us back to the Bodhi tree beneath which the Buddha takes his seat. And if we listen carefully, we can hear him now making his vow to remain here on this spot until he has seen into and through the heart of experience. And perhaps we can still feel the strength and power of that personal vow as it echoes through the world and creates a reaction, a response, a call to arms from everything that seeks to limit, that binds, that obscures the true potential of human life. We probably don't have to, unfortunately, look very deep into our own lives to discover these manifestations of the limiting forces that are playing out within us. The limiting and restrictive forces within the human psyche, but also in the social and cultural value systems that surround and affect and inhabit us all. These are recurring narratives that bind us to the world of Mara. So this vow from this solitary figure of the Buddha named his intention to find a path to liberation through all this. And that vow drew towards him, or drew even out of him, these powerful and often invisible forces that are given the form, given the name of Mara. So this morning what I'm going to be doing is retelling the attack of Mara and describing the 4 forms of this attack and the 4 symbols that reveal the wisdom of the Buddha that transformed these attacks into gifts of blessings. So I'm hoping that those of you who have heard this tale many times will forgive my augmenting of the story to help differentiate between the 4 manifestations of Mara. And I hope through the retelling something of the enormity and the significance of these meetings between Mara and the Buddha to be under the Bodhi tree will be conjured. And I hope in this story, the telling of this story, it also identifies some of the struggles and successes that we face in our own life in the midst of this unprecedented time. So thankfully, some of us are continuing to work to bring us food, to bring us protection, and also the precious healthcare that so many of us need at this time. But whether we are working or living in these comparative isolation, it's true, I'm sure, that our familiar patterns of our lives have been strongly disrupted. And one of the consequences of this is it really allows our limiting habits of being to become so more visible to us. So Mara, in this period of time, Mara is revealed. The props that many of us use to give our life purpose and direction are falling away. And yet it has to be reminded, we need to be reminded that at the same time, the auspicious moon, the full moon of May, it shines on our own potential, the potential of all life. So these are auspicious, opportune times. This pandemic has its own gift within it. This is a time where the veneer of the world wears thin, and we may sense through it the vast open realm of the mysterious Buddha, is seated beyond language, beyond concepts and forms, and yet somehow is utterly knowable and present for us all, here and now and always. So let's start out with the story of the Buddha's great vow and the consequences of that vow. So the Buddha's made this vow and is seated deep in meditation, deep in reflection, steady, upright, relaxed, alert, seated in mottled shade, well-nourished, spacious, seated in the midst of the sounds and the scents of the natural world. And in the distance, there's a rumble, as if of distant thunder. A rumble that grows, that shakes the earth, throwing great clouds of dust up into the air. Coming towards this seated figure is the great army of grotesque demons, carrying huge rocks, massive trunks of dead trees, led by the shrouded figure, the first manifestation of Mara, who is named Machu Mara, the personification of the fear of death, the fear of insubstantiality and impermanence, mounted like a king on an enormous dark elephant. All these beings gradually surround the seated figure of the Buddha, calling out to him, challenging his unshakability. They try to provoke fear, and then without warning, they begin to hurl their weapons of destruction towards this solitary seated figure. And as the huge rocks and the heavy trunks touch the aura of this steadfast being, they miraculously transform into blossoms and fall like offerings, around his seat. So seeing this, Machimara wails in distress and calls away his humbled army. Seeing how their energy has been transformed into offerings, Machimara and his army disperse, seeming to simply dissolve and fade. The dust settles and the seated figure sits contentedly beneath the dappled shade of the Bodhi tree, silent, steady, bright, and attentive. So what are the qualities of this being that can transform these hugely powerful forces? So I've got an image that maybe will help us get a sense of an aspect of these forces. So Lou, if you could thanks very much. So what does this image tell us about the enlightened being that integrates and doesn't need to repel fears and anxieties regarding death? So Mara on this occasion was defeated because the Buddha was without attachment. He relaxed his grip on any position, on any view, and in doing so created an empty seat. As the Heart Sutra tells us, know that the Bodhisattva, holding to nothing whatever, is freed of delusive hindrance, rid of the fear bred by it, and reaches clearest nirvana. So an empty seat, this empty seat is an open space. It's empty and therefore also full of potential. It allows space for spontaneity and it creates the open door to wisdom out of which compassion can naturally arise. The empty seat manifests or becomes fearless because there is nothing to defend, nothing to bolster or control. Life, moment to moment, relies on death, relies on change, on impermanence. Life requires these things to unfold and mature. So the potential of the mystery of the empty seat is those that sit here become less fearful and change can be recognized as a blessing. The fantasy of control is one of many of Mara's gifts that we have unwittingly picked up. So this first attack invites us, reminds us, can we remain centered, awake, relaxed and alert in the face of death? Can we find the space of the empty seat so that we too can dance with the arising and the fading of conditions and release from the fear conjured by the dread-filled power of Machimara? Thanks, Louis, if you wouldn't mind losing that one. So let's return now to the clearing and witness the seated figure of the Buddha once again. And there's more disturbance, this time like a howling wind, swirling and condensing into forms of warriors armed with every conceivable weapon. Heading this great army is the looming figure of Skandamara, seated on a huge white elephant. This is the personification of the delusions that magically create selfhood out of the ever-changing conditions of material form, of feeling, of tone, of perception, volitions and consciousness. Surrounding the seated figure, these armies of conjurers of illusion, these forces that attempt to create permanence where there is only process, unleash their fear, inducing their fear-inducing weaponry. But again, as these weapons meet the aura of the relaxed unshakability of the Buddha to be, the apparent solidity of these dreadful weapons again transform into offering blossoms. So seeing this, Skandamara, the greatest of magicians, again calls off his armies. They disperse, they simply seem to dissolve and fade. The winds cease, the seated figure remains undisturbed, deep in contemplation and clear in his knowing. So what qualities are called upon to bear this attack? So we have another image. The second image, please, Louis. So this is the image of the stupa. So the image of the stupa represents the seeing through not just of death, but of the construct of an I that we create out of the raw elements of conditioned existence. The stupa's shape was offered by the Buddha to remind us of his life. The stupa has become the symbol of remembrance. It reminds us of the 6 elements: earth, water, fire, air, space, and consciousness, that conjoin and dissolve in infinite patterns, creating an ever-changing display of form. So all the inner and outer worlds are created by these elements, and the limited conditioned perspective of our human life, it's imagining that there's something else here that is more than these constituent parts. And this is the illusion that Mara creates to bind us. This leads us to needing to try to protect and bolster this delusion of permanence and substantiality. And this, of course, leads to the suffering that we invariably discover in seeking permanence and substantiality. So the Buddha very much saw through this process. In fact, he described it in a very particular way. He suggested that, that we try to imagine a cart, well, what we call a cart in front of us. And he says, where is the essential nature of the cart? Is it in the wheels, the spokes, the hub of the wheels? Is it in the floor of the cart or its sides, in its shafts or straps? The cart only ever exists as an idea that arises to describe a certain set of conditions. But when the wheels fall off, is it still a cart? Or what about when the floor or the sides break apart? Is it still a cart then? Or when the shafts or the straps wear out? We are no more or less than this. Our sense of there being a me to defend, to bolster, to puff up and put on display is no more than a mental construct. And the stupa reminds us that if we over-identify with this particular coalescing of conditions, we suffer because of the fear of trying to protect something which was never here. And this fear also veils the unconditioned. It veils the unbound, the unfabricated, the trackless, signless path that leads to liberation. So the Buddha had really seen deeply into the truth of conditionality. Therefore, the Buddha didn't rely on any particular conditions, didn't identify with any particular form, feeling, perception, habit, or view. He simply attended, seeing clearly, and this created the conditions for liberation. He saw through, discovered the spontaneous mystery of liberation by seeing through constructs and thereby breaking the spell of Skandamara. Skandamara is defeated by the seeing through. There's no cart, no essential I, no you or me, just interconnectedness, interdependence. And in that clear seeing, everything becomes a potential offering. Blessings rain down, and equanimity and compassion naturally arise. Thanks, Louis. So back again to the Bodhi tree. So this time, in the distance, we can hear singing and laughter. There's a thronging mass of beautifully dressed beings engaged in sparkling conversations. There are dancing figures trying to catch the eye or the ear of the seated figure. There are great flattering orations, seductive words and gestures, enticing distractions, filling the surrounding, filling the clearing in which the Buddha to be is sat. And leading this great throng, seated on the red elephant like a proud parent, is Klesamara. The Klesamara is the personification of everything that sticks and binds, everything that limits the responsive capacity of the heart. Greed, hatred, pride, dullness and distractedness personified by the forces of Klesamara. And this throng can only wonder at the ease and brightness of the seated figure, just as they were attempting to entice and seduce or distract. Now they find themselves drawn into the wonder and the mystery of this being. They grow quiet. They feel their hearts opening and become fascinated by something that they can't quite grasp. They feel a deep longing, and each in turn brings their palms together and bows to the seated figure. Klesamara finds his forces turning their allegiance to the seated figure. Mara has failed to distract the Buddha through these disturbing emotions, and so dissolves and leaves a lucid stillness that once again fills the clearing. Louis? So the image that gives some indication of this response is the wheel. So the wheel represents the Dharma itself, the truth that the Buddha refound, rediscovered. He saw plainly the power of craving, aversion, ignorance, conceit and distractedness that generates suffering. And here, in almost the last throw of the dice, Mara is throwing at him every disturbing emotion, which was quite naturally transformed. So it's transformed not by doing anything, but simply by relaxing and not getting drawn into the display. And in this way, the powerful forces are aligned and pay obeisance and turn towards liberation. Their energy served the longing and transformed the power of the wheel of conditioned existence into the longing for liberation. Thanks, Louis. So we come to the last sequence. So all is quiet around the Bodhi tree, when, pushing through the undergrowth, comes a solitary figure, Deva Putamara, alone and on foot. This is the proud king, bolstered by his unquestioning sense of his own power, standing before the Buddha and demanding an answer to the question, why would anybody want to leave the protection and safety of this dominion? The great king Deva Putamara points out the sublime mental states that can be achieved without leaving his kingdom of conditionality. He points to the pleasures and ease of the mental states that can be found in his realm through skill in meditation, through the cultivation of wealth and power. And he points to the godlike status that can be found by beings right here in this world system. The smile of the silent Buddha enrages Deva Putamara. Stamping his feet almost in childish rage, as a last resort, Deva Putamara makes this last challenge to this relaxed solitary figure seated beneath the tree. Who do you think you are, taking this seat? Who has witnessed you? Who has given you permission to take this seat of liberation? The Buddha says nothing, but simply touches the earth. And at that moment, forming out of the natural world, as if arising out of the earth, the great goddess of the earth arises, bows to the Buddha, and calls to Deva Putamara. I bear witness. Seeing the appearance of such a powerful ally, the haughty figure can only wonder, admit defeat, and slink away. So the final image, Louis, please, the final image reflects this episode. So this is the image of the footprint. So all willed actions leave a mark, a footprint. And the Buddha had complete confidence in the countless small actions that had brought him to this spot. His footsteps were recorded by the earth, the ground of all our being. The Buddha could confidently call upon the earth because he knew he'd arrived at the culmination of his long journey, propelled by inquiry. He knew he'd been able to let go of the fear of death. He'd let go of the illusions of permanence and substantiality. He wasn't swayed by disturbing emotions. He could sit here with complete openness to the natural unfolding that was arising here. He knew he had engaged in every situation in a way that was in alignment to his deepest longings for truth. Each footprint left no residue of ego or limited view. Each footprint was a step into the unknown, the unexplored. Each footstep was fearless, spontaneous, free of grasping, free of aversion, free of pride, free of distraction. Each footstep had the taste of freedom, and the earth goddess knew this in her body. The Buddha was known. The Buddha was seen and witnessed as he walked without going anywhere towards liberation. And all this, just to end, thanks Louis. So the Buddha began his final stages of his path by recollection of his time as a child sitting in wonder and ease beneath the rose apple tree. And his footsteps led him to this seat beneath the tree, beneath the Bodhi tree, and enlightenment in that moment arose. Witnessing the Buddha's liberation, the whole world shook. Countless rainbows filled the skies. Flowers burst into bloom out of season. The full moon and the sun shone alongside each other. The path was wide and open for all beings who have the wisdom eyes to see, the wisdom body to sense, the wisdom ears to listen, the wisdom mind to know. Recalling this tale of liberation, we go for refuge to the Buddha. Honor and revere the Buddha. Celebrate the Buddha in the hope that this path opens for us and all beings in these complex times.